Awesome. Right, so very good evening to you. And welcome to session number 3. Tonight's session is called The Satan of Yahwism, or Early Yahwism. And we're going to be building on some of the things we've been doing in the last 2 sessions. So if you're joining me live, that's always the best. And you please feel free to say hi or introduce yourself. Tell me where you're watching from. I won't be able to respond too much. I've got limited time, and I'd like to make sure I make the most of our time together tonight. So I'm so happy to have you with me. As you can see, it's getting dark really early now, and so I'm realizing that although it's still really hot in Durban, that winter is approaching. It's approaching. It's sneaking up on us. All right, awesome. So we're going to get going immediately tonight. First, maybe just a very, very quick recap. And maybe I can just say that if you are watching for the first time with us, I don't want to chase you away, but I do want to say that to watch with us tonight, you need to go back to the other 2 sessions, because we're going to be using terms and we're building a story here. I'm not preaching at anyone here. I'm not trying to create dogma. They are not self-contained, these lessons. They have to be followed. Welcome to everyone. And if you're just popping in, I'm sure we're going to have a good time. I'm excited about tonight because tonight is the topic I'm dealing with here really changed my life. I have to be honest. What I'm sharing tonight, I first discovered about 2.5 years ago, and it really changed my perspective. But anyway, let's get into it. So, quick recap. Number 1, theologies develop over time. Number 2, we're going to be avoiding like the plague any retrojective interpretations of past scriptures. So we're not going to be pushing our current ideas of Satan back into the old scriptures. We're going to allow the scriptures. We're going to follow a logical approach to chronologically, in other words, in order, more or less, as far as we can, discover how the Old Testament makes us aware of the idea of Satan and how it develops. And so my main argument here is not a dogmatic argument, but it's just an observation from what I think happens when we take the Bible seriously and we really spend time on it for what it says. And that argument here is simply that the idea of Satan is something that evolved. I'm not here to tell you what Satan is like. I'm not here to tell you you have to believe in him, or you have to believe that he's like this, or to try and tell you don't believe in. That's not my job. My job in these couple of sessions is simply to lead you on the journey of how I believe we actually came to the idea that we find in the New Testament. And to your surprise, the idea of Satan, and to my surprise, the idea of Satan in the New Testament also develops further into the Middle Ages to what we have today. But that's not our job. Our job is the Hebrew scriptures. So we're going to be doing that. All right. So avoiding retrojective interpretation, the muffins, right? We know what a muffin is and we know what wheat is, and we're not going to confuse the two. We said that development of Israel's theology is connected to their idea of Satan. In other words, their worldview, their theological worldview includes Satan to some degree or the other. And that changes over time, and let's have a look at a little bit of that. Last week's session was simply a look into the archaeological and the biblical evidence for an argument that basically states that in early Yahwism, or in the first temple period, there seems to have been on the ground, no matter what God was calling Israel into, they were still practicing forms of polytheism. And this is not a nice thing to read, and it's a little bit embarrassing, I guess, to some degree, to see what Psalm says sometimes, and places in Job and other portions that we quickly had a look at. But I think it's pretty much accepted by anyone that's a serious biblical scholar that the early temple period was still, there was a lot of polytheism on the ground. Where the tire hit the road, it was little gods and goddesses, and it just wasn't a monotheism that we see towards the end of the Second Temple Judaism, or what we expect and what we might see in the New Testament, and obviously not of modern Jews, right? Okay, so let's get into tonight. So, if we assume that the larger modern scholarship consensus is correct, and that Israel was not strictly monotheistic, but largely polytheistic. Until the time of the exile, and some say even later, we'll just pin it at the time of the exile, we could, in this light, consider why there was so little mention of Satan in this early period at all. Now, I've given the whole thing away already, but I want to do it like this. And I want you to refer, if you have time, maybe later on, to have a look at the schematic I uploaded during this week. I've spent a lot of time on that thing. A lot of double checking and a lot of careful consideration. But tonight we're going to be what the schematic basically does is it gives you the two temple periods, first temple period and second temple period, and then it lists on the left all the books where we find mention of the word Satan, right? And then because of the way that I've ordered those books, you can see that there is a pattern that kind of happens moving from left to right. So we're going to be dealing with the blue section of that schematic tonight, which includes the book of Numbers. And let me say right now that although most people agree that Numbers was written in the 6th century, scholars also are quite confident that the material used in Numbers, specifically in the chapter 22 verse 22, which is the portion we'll be dealing with, comes from the early Elohist sources, which is actually 8th century sources, or quite a bit back. And that's why the schematic points back when it's dealing with Numbers. But we're dealing with all of that stuff kind of on the left-hand side of the exile. All right. So this came to me as a huge surprise, that in the early temple, first temple, or books that were more or less written under this first temple period, there is very little mention of Satan. Like, this came as a surprise to me. And, you know, if you really think about this, what do you expect to see as a Christian? What do you expect to see in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and some of the earlier some of the books that follow that, Judges, etc., etc.? Well, I would expect to see in Genesis an account of this battle between God and the angels and the rebellion of Satan, and there's nothing like that. There's nothing like that. I would expect to see that in the battle against Pharaoh, where God sends his angels, the angel of death, and sends all the plagues, that Satan had to play a role in that. You know, I mean, Satan's got to be behind Pharaoh. Like, you know, Pharaoh's moving, but Satan's the puppet master. Why does Exodus not mention Satan at all? No mention of the word Satan in Genesis. No mention of the word Satan in Exodus. Why don't we find the spiritual warfare themes that we find later on? We'll get to those. But why don't we find spiritual warfare themes in the conquest, for instance, of Canaan? Why isn't Satan there, the real opposing force behind the Canaanites? Why isn't he mentioned at all? These are questions that I started asking a little bit later on, and maybe you're hearing these questions for the first time, but it is so strange that, I mean, at least as a Christian, I would expect Satan to be mentioned in the Torah. You know, the Torah, it is the absolute center of the Old Testament and of the Hebrew Scriptures. Everything else is written around that. The history is written around that. The history of Judges and King Samuel, all of that is commentary on what has happened because of the Torah. Even the prophets really is commentary on the Torah. And you would expect a theological idea like Satan, as we have it formed today, you would expect it to appear in the Torah, and it is so absent. It is so absent that the silence is, it shouts at you once you think about it. So this is the weird thing about early Yahwism, is that you hardly find this word. But when you do find it, in other words, what I'm saying is that in the Torah, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch for most of us as we understand it, there's really one verse, there's 2 verses in the same chapter that uses the word Satan in the entire thing. And it uses it not like you would expect it to be used at all. And this is really strange to me. And we're going to be talking about why this happens. And we're going to be also having a look at some of these ideas. I want to make just mention of the fact that in the Torah, no angels have names. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. Mostly they are called the angels of Yahweh, the angelos. Angelos is Greek. Malach of Yahweh. They are called the angels of the Lord, or the angel of God. No angels have names, and I just pin that in the board. We'll get back to that at some point. So, we don't see this type of language in the Torah, in the first 5 books. And even when we get to the other books, which we know to be first temple period books like King Samuel, it's so absent that it is alarmingly absent. And this is one of the reasons that put me on this mission. What's going on here? This is not how the Bible should look. This is not what it should sound like. Anyway, so what we do find in the first temple period is we do find the word Satan. Yes, we do. This idea of Satan in the first temple period, there's 2 Hebrew words for Satan. The first word is, for those of you who have lexicons or Strong's Concordances, it's H7853. The word is Satan, and it's the primitive root. And the root in Hebrew is always a verb. And this verb means to attack or to accuse, right? Great. So it is normally translated in the King James Version as adversary, it's only ever really translated as resistance and enemy in that sense, right? As in a verb sense. Then the second word is H7854, which comes from the previous one. It's also Satan. It basically looks exactly the same in the Hebrew. There's just a little copy missing somewhere, I think. And that is the noun that comes from that verb. And this literally means adversary or an opponent, right? This word is normally translated in the King James as either Satan, adversary, or to withstand someone. In other words, to oppose someone. So we should immediately be clear from this single bit of information is that this word Satan is normally used here as a verb or a noun, or maybe a title by extension. But it is never used as someone's name in the first temple period. In other words, when me and you are going to engage, and you'll see for yourself, I'm not going to have to convince you of this because it's obvious. It's never used as the name of some being. It's always used as a descriptive word to explain an action that is taken, or to explain a position that someone takes in. All right. So here we go. Just to say again, no uses in Exodus. 0 uses for Satan in Exodus, 0 in Genesis, 0 in Leviticus, 0 in Deuteronomy, like literally 0. There's only 1 usage, and that's in the 22nd chapter of Numbers, which is the 5th book of the Torah. And some people believe it's a summary to some degree of and kind of like the last one written, and a summary of the other was put together. Whatever you believe about that, it's fine. But this is in the story in Numbers 22 of Balaam. Now, Balaam was a non-Israelite prophet who the king of Moab tried to bribe to curse Israel. You can go read the story on your own. I'm not telling that story here. I don't have time for that. But basically what happens is king of Moab, he sends a bunch of guys with money and say, look, you need to do this for us. You need to curse Israel for us. And Balaam says, I can't, right? I can't do that. Fine, okay. They go back to Moab and the king of Moab and say, look, Balaam won't do it. So he sends more money and more stuff. And they get to Balaam again. And Balaam says, look, sleep here the night. I'll find out. And Balaam asks God again. And it seems like in this portion, God says to him, okay, go with these guys. All right. So next day, Balaam is up and he's on his way. He's with all these guys that come to bribe him to curse Israel. And that's when we get to Numbers 22:22. And it says the following, that God was angry with them, right? God tells him to go, and then God's angry with him. And this is what it says, verse 22. And God's anger was kindled because he went. This is pretty strange, because God told him he could go. And the angel of the Lord, the Malach of Yahweh, stood in the way for a Satan against him. All right, so this is first use in the Bible, in the book of Numbers. Here, the word is translated as an adversary. I'm going to put the word Satan in there, and I'm going to say, because that's the real Hebrew word, there is the angel of the Lord stood in the way as a Satan to him. All right, okay, let's leave that at that. Let's leave the second portion, 10 verses further, same story. Let me read that. And the angel of the Lord said to him, you know, the donkey talks and all sorts of things happen here. But eventually he faces up to the angel of the Lord that comes to confront him. He says, wherefore, King James, wherefore hast thou smitten thine ass these 3 times? Behold, I went out to Satan you, because your way is perverse before me. All right, so here we have a messenger from God, an angel. Our Bible says angel. The word is messenger. And he opposes Balaam. Who's in the wrong? Balaam is in the wrong. The angel comes as a messenger from God. But the angel identifies himself as a Satan or an adversary or an opponent. And he comes to withstand or to Satan. Remember, Satan is it's a verb and it's a noun. These 2 uses that we find. Okay, so let me say the obvious. If you haven't picked this up by now, we note a couple of things, obvious things, about the nature of the use of the word Satan here. Right. Number 1, the angel is sent by God and is called a Satan, not Satan as a name, a Satan as an adversary, an opponent, right? Satan was not the name of the angel. Don't get that wrong. Here, it can mean nothing else but the simple understanding of a normal Hebrew word. The angel was to oppose him and withstand him, and was so called an opponent, an adversary, a Satan. To resist him, and so to be called a resistor. In other words, he went to Satan him as a Satan. Right. So, we cannot make the muffin mistake here. And I find myself making this mistake here very early on. I caught myself sitting and thinking, yes, this is an amazingly good use of the word Satan, because Satan actually means a being that did A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You can't do that here. And the reason why you can't do that here is because we're not dealing with a muffin here. We're dealing with the wheat. We're dealing with the first occurrence of the word in the Hebrew scripture. And we are not allowed at this point to say, oh, Satan is a great choice here because the angel is acting like Satan. That's a whole problem in itself, because the angel is doing good. In other words, the word Satan here is not even used as an evil thing or an evil deed. It's actually here a good action on behalf of God. So be careful of the muffin mentality here, where you think of this word, and when you read the word, you think, oh, yes, no, Satan would have done something like this, or this word is used because of my idea of Satan. Can't do that. That's an illogical approach. It's retrojective interpretation, and you're going to make a big mistake here if you do that. Rather take this for what it says. This is the first mention of a Hebrew word that means an enemy or someone that withstands you, right? Okay, so there is no previous precedent in the whole of the Torah, or mention in the whole of the Torah, of a creature called Satan, so that we can say, this is a great use of the word because of what I know about the devil or what I know about Satan. There's no precedent, no previous precedent, and there is no mention in all of the Torah of this word until in Numbers 22:22. I find that absolutely amazing. In this ancient context, the angel's name is not Satan, that's obvious. Satan is a normal Hebrew word used to describe the function of the mission that the angel was sent on. He was sent to resist, to be an opponent, a resistor to Balaam's naughty ways. The angel is not the opponent of God, but he is the opponent of Balaam, right? Thus, the term Satan is not even a description used exclusively for an evil opponent in this early times, but can also be used as the description of an opponent that actually withstands evil or perverseness. Satan here is the word that describes someone that goes and opposes a bad person, right? Satan here is an ally of the good. The word Satan here is morally neutral. It is just a normal Hebrew descriptive verb and noun. Right, that might come as a surprise. That came as a surprise to me, that after the 5 books of the Torah, this and that's it, guys. That's it for the entire Pentateuch. That's it for the entire Torah. I find it bamboozles me. I cannot believe that I've never seen this. I cannot believe that I've never thought about this. Satan didn't feature in the Torah, which forms the basis of the entire Old Testament. It's weird, right? So let's move on a little bit. We get to the book of Samuel. 1 Samuel 29, right? Here, and we're going to look at the uses of the word here. The Philistines, they are worried that David, who now went to hide with them, might, in the heat of battle, he might actually turn against them, right? This is what's going on here. I'm not giving full context of the story. Here's the verse, 1 Samuel 29, verse 4b. Lest in battle he be a Satan to us. Now, this is the Philistines speaking about David. And so they are worried that David would, in the heat of battle, turn against them and become an enemy to them, an opponent to them, or an adversary to them. And here we find the second mention of the word Satan in the Old Testament. They were worried that David was going to be a Satan to them, an adversary. Right. Here the word Satan, once again, careful of the muffin trap here. The word Satan is simply a descriptive Hebrew word, describing the possible actions of David against the Philistines. Let's move on. One mention in the whole book of Samuel. Let's move on to 2 Samuel. All right, maybe we can find something a little bit more juicy here, because it's really boring at the moment. In this passage in 2 Samuel 19, David describes the sons of Zeruiah as possible enemies to him. Let me read 2 Samuel 19:22a to you. And David said, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should be this day Satans unto me?" Right, okay. Now, for those who don't know, Zeruiah was not a demon or a principality or anything else but a person, right? A patriarch of some sort who had sons that were coming, and David was worried that these sons would become his enemies. And so it's a lament. It's David saying to these sons of Zeruiah, "Why have you come to be enemies to me?" And the Hebrew word for enemy here is the word Satan. So once again, if we are able to see through the eyes of the writer of this passage and not force modern ideas about Satan back onto this passage retrospectively, it seems clear that there's no connection with anything else than the description of a possible opposition between two human identities. It would be disingenuous here to assume that the use of the word Satan is somehow referring to a deeper understanding, New Testament, I'd say, by the way, regarding a creature called Satan, and that is somewhere that now is making a symbolic appearance in this portion. I think that would be disingenuous to make that type of conclusion. It would simply be thinking the wrong way around. It would be a good example, though, of retrojective interpretation, going back to the wheat and say, you see this wheat here, you see these kernels of wheat, these are actually little muffins. Can't do that. And that, folks, is the entire books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. Two small portions, two small mentions of the word Satan. Right. Now let's get to Kings. Surely in Kings we'll find some spiritual warfare, some principality fighting against David, some mention of the devil that comes to be an opponent to David. But what we really find in 1 Kings 5 is we're dealing with Solomon here. Solomon here makes a declaration that finally God has given him rest from his enemies. and rest from bad occurrences and circumstances in his life. So this is found in 1 Kings 5 verse 4. I'm just checking my time to make sure I stay in time here. Let me read it for you. It says, "But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, so that there is no Satan nor evil occurrent." So once again here, it's a very, very simple context. Satan here is an enemy that would take the form of another king that would be an enemy unto Solomon. And Solomon's making the declaration, I guess, in thankfulness to God, that he no longer has enemies and that he now has rest and no more calamity around him. Our second mention in the first book of Kings is here in 1 Kings 11. 1 Kings 11 verse 14. What's going on here? Well, obviously Solomon's peace and rest doesn't last too long, because as we've learned last week, Solomon was not as innocent as we all like for him to be. And that's the title for last week's session. This peace doesn't last long, and God quickly raises up many Satans for him, right? So 1 Kings 11:14 goes like this. "And the Lord stirred up a Satan to Solomon." Oh yeah, here we go. Let's see who it is. And it gives him a name, Hadad the Edomite. Oh, what a letdown. This, once again, it's got nothing to do with some spiritual being. At this point in the Hebrew scriptures, it simply is a king that became an adversary to King Solomon. Now, moving to verse 23, God stirred up another adversary. Hebrew word Satan. Once again, a name, Rezin, the son of Eliada. Eliada. Oh, difficult one. All right. So this is 1 Kings 11:23. And guys, this is the crazy part about all of this. That's it. For the whole First Temple period, we have 2 mentions in the book of Samuel, basically 2 in the book of Kings. We have that 1 back in the book of Numbers, and we have 2 left in the second book of Psalms that we want to have a look at. But I think you can, I hope, that by this point, you realize that the early understanding of the Hebrew word Satan had nothing to do with the name for a being. It was an adjective to some degree. It was a descriptive of an enemy, or used as a verb, as in the act of becoming an enemy, or the act of resisting, or the act of opposing. Now, this is not something I am making up. This is something we learn from the scriptures, right? 2 more that I'd like to deal with tonight, and I think we're doing really, really good for time. And we now go to the book of Psalms. Now, the book of Psalms is slightly more tricky than something like Numbers, Kings, Samuel, simply just because dating Psalms is incredibly difficult. As you know, there's 100 and... now I've forgotten how many Psalms. I was about 170, 119. That's the only one I remember, the long one. There's a lot of Psalms, 152 or something like that. And they stretch over a very, very long period of time. And some of them were written by David. Some of them were written for David. But there's also many Psalms that are anonymous. And there's Psalms written for other people or by other people, right? So Psalms is very hard to date. But what scholars have been able to establish is the Psalms basically consists of 5 books. They start with a type of introduction at the beginning, and you can do a bit of reading on that if you want. That's not my job here. But there's 5 books of the Psalms. For instance, the first book is Psalms mainly written by or for David, and by the time we get to book 5, it's mostly anonymous Psalms, right? So it's really hard to date them. We cannot necessarily assume that they're written in chronological order, so it's a little bit tricky. But what I would like to do is, we have 3 mentions of Satan in the book of Psalms. The first 2 are found in the second book. That's what we're going to be dealing with now. And then there's 1 mention in the 5th book, and then we're going to push that on into next session. So we want to try and deal with mostly the very early mentions, obviously, of the book of Satan. Of the very early mentions of Satan in the Hebrew Bible. it might be worthwhile just to mention that because Psalms, and you can refer to the schematic here, Psalms actually ranges, the dating of Psalms ranges over a long period of time, starting quite early and moving into the second temple period across the exile. So if there is such thing as an evolution or development of the idea of Satan in Israeli theology, we could expect, because Psalms ranges over such a long time, we could possibly see that development or evolution take place within the Psalms itself. I wouldn't bet my life on that, but I'm just making the point. Can have a look at that for yourself if you like. So let's move on. And one more thing about the Psalms, and this is pretty important, I think, to take note. Number one, that we have to bear in mind that the Psalms, when we're dealing with Psalms, we're no longer dealing with history. We're no longer dealing with someone writing historically. In the Psalms, it's a different type of literature, right? Okay, it's more artistic in its expression. It's songs we're dealing with. It's poems. Therefore, it contains symbolism. It contains metaphoric language, and there's a sense of artistic license that we find in the Psalms, which are tools that the writers employ or use to make a song great. I mean, today, if you think about the way people write songs, they're not writing historical truth. They're writing truth through symbolism, etc., etc. Okay, so the only point I would like to make here is that Psalms, as they are songs, as far as we know, songs normally take poetic form. They are more an artistic expression of the writer's perspective or his truth, for that matter. All right, put that aside. Let's go to the mentions of Satan in Psalm. Psalm 38, verse 20. Okay, let's listen. This seems to be a psalm by David. Sometimes we're not sure if David wrote them, but I think this one says by David. Anyway, David describes his enemies that will render him evil for good as his Satans. All right, so, David had a hard time. It wasn't an easy life. He was a man of war, and he had a lot of enemies, and some of these psalms are basically songs of him being depressed somewhere in a corner because of all the bad things people have done to him, and those are still looking for his blood and his head, I guess. Psalm 38, verse 20 reads like this. They also that render evil for good are my Satans, because I follow the thing that is good. In the psalm, David is mentioning his enemies, and he is saying that these enemies of him, although he has done well and done good, they are rendering him evil for good. So the idea of Satan here fits very much into the category we have already discovered so far in the First Temple period, from Numbers, Samuel, and Kings. That let me do the second one, and then I'm going to summarize what I've just said. The second one is also found in the second book of Psalms, and this is in Psalm 71, verse 13. The writer here calls his enemies that they are Satans to his soul. So 71, verse 13 reads like this. It says, let them be confounded and consumed that are Satans to my soul. All right, so up until this point, and these are really, these, and there's a couple of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think we've mentioned 7. These are, guys, this is the thing, these are the only mentions of the word Satan in the First Temple period. As far as, that, definitely the only mentions, as far as we can correctly date the books, these are the only mentions. Now, once again, I'd like to just state the obvious, because it's not that I'm worried that you're going to miss the obvious point here, but maybe, sometimes it needs to be stated. In the First Temple period, the Hebrew word Satan was always used once for an angel that wasn't a bad angel. It was an angel from God that came to resist a person doing something bad, right? The rest of the time, it's used for humans that are enemies, adversaries to people like Solomon, David, etc. So it's very clear that the uses for the word Satan, verb or noun, is always used in this regard in First Temple Yahwism, or in the First Temple period, or what's called early Yahwism, and in terms of time, the late Iron Age. Like, why is this like that? Why is it like that? And And why is there no being called Satan in this period? That's what I want to know. Why is there no mention of this being in this period? Up until this point, let me read what I wrote here. I've got 10 minutes. Up until this point in the Hebrew scriptures, there's been no indication whatsoever that the term Satan was used as a name, which is the only way it's the only way we use it today, right? So this is why I believe that there was a development. The way we understand Satan today and the way that these people, at least let's say the people of the time of the Torah or the writers of the Torah or the Pentateuch, first 5 books, their way of approaching this Satan and our way of approaching it is not the same. The question is what happened in between, right? And that's why we're busy with this discussion. So it's not used whatsoever as a name for an evil spirit that is in opposition to God. Rather, it is used as a verb or a noun that simply describes the action or the vehicle in opposing another human and not God. Well, this is one of the first points you have to acknowledge from the scriptural references we've mentioned tonight. In this period, Satan is not an opponent for God. That is not there. It's not in the Bible. I can't say it's not in the Bible. It's not in the Torah. It's not in the first temple period. It's just not there. The question is, why is it not there? This is absolutely puzzling. It is used as a descriptive word for angels, once for an angel, the rest of the time for humans, when they are enemies to each other. It's amoral. It's not necessarily a bad opposition, but it's sometimes used for good opposition. It just breaks all the boundaries that we might have put around a word such as this. So my job here is not dogmatic conclusion, right? I am after the progression from the scriptures and to show the development. So that is important. Right. So let me read my conclusion to you. Coming to the end of our discussion on the first temple period, right? And this is our final little piece on that. And the surprising and actually boring appearances of the idea of Satan from this first temple period in the Hebrew scriptures. You might be tempted to ask the following question: why is there no mention of Satan as a being that opposes God? Why is it never used as the name for anything? Sorry, let me read that again. Why is there no mention of Satan as a being that opposes God or that is responsible for and causes evil in the world? Because that's how we look at Satan today. Our modern idea of looking or understanding Satan is he's the responsible for all the bad stuff, responsible for all the evil. And secondly, he is the opposite of God. He's God's opposition. I can't help but think of when I grew up, Carmen had a song, I can't even remember what it was called, but it was Jesus and the devil boxing in a boxing ring, and my word, Jesus only just beat him. It was like a Rocky show, you know, like Rocky. He got beaten up badly and then he just made it in the last round. Why is there nothing like this in the first temple period? Now, I don't want you to, while I'm saying this, say to me, or think like this and say, oh, Franz, but what about Paul? And what about Jesus? And what about Matthew? And what about Daniel? I know all those scriptures, and I know you know them. But we can't, in our journey of starting from the beginning, assume that the writers of the Torah had the perspective of Paul, or the perspective of Jesus, or the perspective of Matthew, or the perspective of Franz du Plessis in 2023. We cannot do that. That is retrojective interpretation. That is looking for the muffin in the corn kernels. The wheat kernels. Can't do that. Yes, we can look at the muffin today and say, I think there's wheat in here. We can examine it scientifically and say, yeah, there's definitely some wheat in here. But my word, you're not going to find the muffin in the wheat. You're going to find wheat in the muffin. All right, so that's the question I'm putting to you. And I'm not really going to give you a dogmatic answer, but I am going to give you the answer that most biblical scholars look at. For the reason why early Yahwism does not really see the champion. I just see that now. Thanks, Jules. The champion, yeah. what is the answer that most biblical scholars give for this weird phenomenon I've tried to describe to you tonight, right? Okay, so here we go. It's in my words. Think about the nation of Israel during this period, when the collective consciousness of a people like Israel are still steeped in forms of polytheism. And this is why we did last week's session, right? Even in contrast to the law or what God might maybe require from them, it seems like they still operated under polytheistic expectations and memory. And they also then would have thought about their theology and their worldview, the way that the world worked and the way that the spiritual world might have worked. Although back then there was no idea of spiritual world and natural world. It was all one world for the ancients. But they might have had polytheistic ideas of what this, I'm going to call it spiritual world for lack of a better way to describe it, what this would have looked like, right? So, their worldview, as we have seen, or their practicing worldview, was largely still polytheistic. Now, here's the thing. For pagan polytheists, the existence of evil and calamity in the world can quite easily be explained. Right? Why is this? Well, it can easily be explained because when you have many gods, evil is always the result of some other god. Some god going rogue on us. Because they really didn't see their gods as they really saw their gods like as just super like human beings. Like some of these gods really did some bad stuff, right? And it was easy to explain the calamity that happened over there because it was this god that did that, or you didn't bring enough offerings to this god. You might ask yourself, why would they have Asherah in their homes and in their temple while they were worshiping Yahweh? Well, Asherah, the thing with Asherah is that she was the god of fertility and war and love and so on. And so in terms of, you would worship Yahweh for this and that, but when it came to fertility or maybe something else, you'd have to bring a little sacrifice here just to make sure you have her patronage. So the point is that evil could easily be explained away by saying, oh, God, that God did it, or we didn't bring enough offerings to that God, or that God is angry with us, or it's the God of the Ammonites that's caused all of this raucous over here. This was a very common way of writing, not only by the ancient Near East, but also, even the Canaanite type of literature that we find. So that's the thing. For pagan polytheists, the existence of evil and calamity in a world can be easily explained as the result of some god or some of the sons of God, as we tried to explain last week. They've gone rogue, or they're unable to control their emotions, their anger, etc. They did not believe their gods to be morally superior to humans, and good and evil in that world was simply at the whim of the sometimes very unpredictable gods. And there is no real requirement there in that worldview for a being that is wholly evil and stands in opposition to God. It's just not required. You just don't find it in ancient polytheism because there's absolutely no need for it. There's no need to have God, to have opposition to God. And maybe, I don't know, it's my guesswork, but maybe this is why in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Judges, you just don't find God's opposition. Like you just don't, it's weird, guys, but I don't know if you've ever thought about this. The only opposition to God is people. The Canaanites are in opposition to God because they serve other gods, but there's no spiritual force that is God's opponent that comes and opposes him as the proponent or the protagonist of the evil in the world. It is very clear to me, and I'm trying to just explain that the early Israelites did not understand God and Satan like we do today. And I think that's the point. And the question is, why? Well, possibly because they were still largely polytheistic. And they had no need for such an opposing force. They had all these other gods. And I watched a talk by a rabbi today, and in that he claims that early Israelite religion, and even later on, they just don't have the space for God having an opposing force. It's just not in the fabric of what they believe. It's not Christian, like it's not how Christians see these things. So it seems like a largely still polytheistic First Temple Israel would think along the same lines, because they were still thinking in polytheistic terms, right? And this could be the reason why we don't find mention of a being called Satan in First Temple Yahwism. They did not need him to make theological sense of their worldview. While their primary God, Yahweh, was the source of good, other gods were the source of evil. We find in the Psalms, for instance, as we read last night in Psalms 82, that God at some point sits with these Elohim and calls them out and says, hey, why are you not judging properly? This could be an indication for us that early on the Israelites believed that the calamities in the world was a result of some of these gods not doing a proper job. All right, anyway. One of the other gods did it. It was the god of the pagans who brought about this calamity. Maybe one of the lesser gods in understanding that they didn't judge correctly. Yahweh remains untamed, because there's no doubt in my mind that they believed that Yahweh was a good God. I think that is quite clear to me. But Yahweh remains untainted by evil, or as the source of evil, because there were these other gods that were responsible for things and didn't always do a good job. So there really is no need for a dualistic worldview. This means a worldview in which there's two opposite forces, God and Satan. It just wasn't needed to make sense of the world. And that is probably why we don't find Satan in the First Temple period explained the way we see him today. They have no need for this being. As long as God is one amongst others, there's no need for one being to be God's opposition and the source of evil. All right, I'm finished. Simply put, First Temple Yahwism does not know the Satan that Matthew, the writer of that the writer of Matthew in the New Testament knows. First Temple Yahwism and Matthew's view of Satan, it is not the same, right? Okay, it's not there. The question is, why is it not there? We've tried to give some form of an explanation, but I have even a greater question. What happened and how did it get there? How did we go from an early version of Yahwism, where Satan literally doesn't feature, to a place where Matthew starts by saying, for instance, first mention of Satan probably in Matthew is that when Jesus goes into the desert, Satan's right there and he's an opponent. He comes to tempt, destroy, etc., etc. How did we get to Matthew's view? If early Yahwism looked like this, how did we get to Matthew's view? Right, that's that. That's that for tonight, at least. So next week, we're going to be talking about the Babylonian exile. We're going to be talking about some of the monotheistic pressures on Israel, because it is obvious to us that Israel eventually became monotheistic. The question is, what brought them to monotheism? If the law and Moses couldn't bring them to monotheism, what did eventually bring them to monotheism? And the bigger question, and this is really what we're after, how did that affect their view of this thing called Satan? So that we'll be dealing with next week. Thanks so much for spending this time with me. If you have questions, if you put questions in the comments, I'm going to answer them in the comments. If you send them to me by messenger in a private sense, I will answer them in a private sense. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I'm quite happy to, as long as they relate to the topic we're busy with, then I'm very happy to spend time in answering them. Guys, thanks so much. Have a lovely evening. Cheers.